We're going to look at arrays today. Arrays allow us to store more than one value inside a variable. Arrays in Java have a fixed size, so you decide how many variables you want to be able to store, and that's the number you can store. You can't expand that or shrink it. And I guess one way to think of an array is a bit like a shot glass holder. A shot glass holder can hold a fixed number of shot glasses, so it's a fixed number of the same thing, and they have a you can change the shot in any given position in a shot holder, but you can't add more shots than there are spaces, and you can't put something else in a shot glass. So you can't put a pint of beer in a shot glass holder. Okay, so in terms of how we go about creating an array, we will specify the type. So let's say we want to store a number of integers. Maybe they're going to represent the marks that we get for the modules that we're studying. We use the type that we want, okay, but then we add a set of square brackets after the type, and that means that we are going to store more than one, typically, of that type of item, and then we give it a name just like we would. So marks. So maybe just to put this into comparison, if we declare a single mark, that might be like that. But for an array of marks, we might say, okay, we want an array of integer, and we want to say that that is going to be equal to, and we use the new keyword, a bit like when we create the scanner, for example, and then you can see it's suggesting new int. And what is different here is we specify the size of the array. So if we're doing, for example, let's say we've got 4 modules of study and we want to store the marks from all of our 4 modules, we put the number inside the square brackets. Okay, now that means that the mark integer array can store 4 integers, but at the moment there won't be a value inside, or there'll be a default value, one of the two, inside our array if we want to use it. So we can find out. So let's have a look. Let's try and access one of the items in the array. So in terms of getting things out of an array, okay, you can specify the position or the index of the item in the array that you want to get out using an integer. Okay, so when we have 4 items in an array, they range from position 0 to 3. Okay, so we could set a value. We could say marks 0, so that would be the first item in the marks array, and we could set it to 23. Okay, so not very good mark, but never mind. Okay, let's set the second one to 65, so that's a bit better. Okay, so both of those values are stored in the array. Okay, if we wanted to get one out, say we wanted to print it, we could just say, let's print out the first item. So let's just run that and see what happens. Now we get our value of 23. Okay, if we change that to a 1, we'll get this value of 65. Okay, and let's just see what happens if we try and access something at position 2. So there is space in our array for this, okay, but we haven't actually specified a value. Okay, so if we've got an integer array, we get a default value of 0. Okay, if we were using different types, we can have arrays of different types, we might find we get what's called a null pointer exception, where there isn't actually a value specified, but because primitive types can't be null, we get a default value. That allows us to set the values. We set it, we use the name of the array, square bracket, and the type, and the index, and give it a value, and we read it out. We could have put this in a separate value, so we could have done something like int first mark equals marks 0. That gets it out, and then we could print the first mark. Okay, so if we run that, we should see that that is being printed out. What we can't do, for example, is try and set a value outside the bounds of the array. So bear in mind that with 4 as the capacity, the indexes are 0, 1, 2, and 3, so index always starts at 0. So if I try and set something at 4, which would be the 5th item in the array, that isn't a valid position. Okay, so let's try and run this code here. We'll get rid of that for now and just see what happens when we do that. Okay, and you can see here it says exception in thread main java.lang, and we get this particular exception which is an array index out of bounds exception. Okay, and if we just have a look here, you can see it says index 4 out of bounds for length 4. Okay, so that basically means we've tried to go past the size, the end of the array, and get something, and it's saying that we can't do that. There's not the ability to get that information out. Okay, and you can see here it's because it knows that we've set this as 4, it's actually warning us and saying it will be outside of the bounds of the index anyway. So it's warning us anyway, but it won't always be able to do that because we might not specify the size of the array programmatically. We might, for example, ask our user, how many things do you want to store? Okay, so typically what we might do then is we might set all the values. So we could do, marks 2, and we could set that to 78, and then marks 3, and that would be, 12. Okay, now you can imagine if you've got a long array, this could get rather time consuming, and it's quite verbose. It's a lot of code if you know what the values are going into your array at the start. So we do have a sort of easier way of creating an array of items, and that is to, rather than specify the number, we can put in a series or a set of curly braces, and we can put in the values for our array. Oh, I've accidentally deleted the square brackets, so we still need the square brackets, but instead of putting the size inside the square brackets, we put the items in the braces and separate them with a list. So I can't remember exactly what the marks were. Maybe it was a 23. Oops, I'll comment first. Maybe it was a 23, a 65, a 78, and a 12. Okay, so that does the same as what we did before. So we've got an array with 4 items. Now if I wanted to get an item out, I could say int second mark equals marks 1. Remember, it's 0 based. And then I could print second mark. So if I do that, I should get a value of 65. Oops, we've made a mistake, and by the looks of things, added an extra curly brace. So if we look here, I've got 2 opening curly braces, but 3 closing ones. So we can just get rid of that one and run that again. So just a note, if you get this error here, class interface or enum expected, then it's basically, there's a good chance that you have, for example, tried to close off an extra bracket because it's expecting something else before that closing bracket. So let's run it again, and we can we get our value of 65 from our array. So as I say, sizes with arrays are fixed. Later in the year, we will look at different data types where we can store more than, or where we can change the size of the items in the collection. But with arrays, it's whatever size we declare it at. What else can we do? Well, we can have different types of arrays. So let's say, for example, I wanted to have a list of names stored instead. So let's clear this out. And again, we just use the type. So any underlying type, any type we've used so far, double, string, int, float, long, we can create an array of those. Again, it's the type followed by a set of square brackets, then the name of the collection. So typically the name of the collection will be plural because it will store more than one of something. So, we had 1 mark, but we had multiple marks. So the array was called marks. I've got a collection of names. So I'll call it names as opposed to name. Again, we then do new string square brackets. We can either decide how many names we want to store by typing the number in there. Again, we can choose whatever number we like. Or we can say, well, actually, I'm going to declare those items in in a square bracket in the curly braces, and this would be known as an array literal. So we have string literals, we have numeric literals. This is an array literal because it's literally an array. Obviously the type this time are strings, so I could put in some names in here. Oops, you have to make sure you put the comma between the items and not inside the string. And there we go, we've got some names now. Let's add maybe a couple more. Oops, again. And who else should we put in there? There we go. Okay, so there we've got 6 items. So obviously we can get an individual item out. If I wanted Ralph's name out, I could say string last name equals names, square bracket, put in the index, which will be 5 in this case. And then if I wanted to print that, I could print out last name. Okay, so let's run that. And we should see Ralph's name coming out. Again, we can change things. So we obviously at the start, before we used array literals, we created arrays and then put each item individually. So if I want to replace Ralph's name, I could say names. I can get rid of this for now because we're not using it. In fact, let's put that underneath. We could say names 5 and we could assign it a new value. Okay, so we could change this to Thaddeus, for example. And if we run it now, although the original value in the array at position 5 is Ralph, here we change it to Thaddeus, then we get that name out and print it. But we could, for example, just print the value directly rather than storing it in a variable first. So we can just make it absolutely clear that it's the value from the array and run it again. And we can see that value there. Okay, so what we can't do, we can't mix types. So for example, I couldn't put in like a 4 after this. It will complain, we'll get a value, an error, and it will say required type string, and we provided an integer, and it's suggesting we try and convert that integer to a string in order to be able to use it. Obviously I've typed it in by mistake, so I can just get rid of it. One other thing to be aware of, I think that Java will let you actually declare it as an array on the variable name. This works, but it will probably warn you that it's not following convention. Yeah, it's not necessarily the right convention for Java. So although that is still technically valid, I would recommend you get into the habit of using the square brackets on the type. Makes it much clearer. You know that it's an array of strings, as opposed to seeing string and then seeing the square brackets there, which can be a bit more confusing. So that's a basic introduction to arrays.